Dr. Nathaniel Ward was a man with a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity. From a young age, his fascination with human biology led him to become one of the most brilliant and promising geneticists of his generation. He believed science was the key to humanity's progress, and he saw genetics as a way to overcome disease and extend life. Driven by this ideal, he dedicated himself to studying and understanding the mysteries of DNA. His ambition was to save lives, revolutionize the world, and leave a legacy that would be remembered for generations. However, he did not know that his ambition would place him on a path toward forces with very different plans. It all began when he received a tempting proposal from a consortium whose financiers were shrouded in secrecy. Without knowing their faces or intentions, Ward knew only that they were powerful and influential people, interested in testing the limits of science without the ethical restrictions of academia. They offered freedom and unlimited resources, an irresistible temptation for someone with Ward's potential and ambition. Accepting the proposal meant giving up any sense of morality imposed by society. Before long, he accepted, with scientific curiosity and the prospect of new breakthroughs overpowering his judgment. After agreeing to the project, Ward was immediately transferred to an isolated base in Antarctica, where all the equipment and infrastructure needed for his research awaited him. The lab, encased in ice, had an aura of mystery that filled him with both excitement and fear. There, he began to realize that the consortium was not merely a group of scientists interested in humanity's progress. They were people with their own objectives and a carefully defined agenda, one that depended entirely on absolute control. His supervisors showed little interest in pure science and were instead focused on quick results and practical applications. Still, the scientist believed he could use this opportunity to pursue a long-held dream: human cloning. There was something unsettling about how easily they offered him resources, but his excitement about scientific advancement blinded him to any suspicions. After all, to him, science had to be bold and transgressive. He believed that research freedom would be an irreversible path to curing disease and overcoming death. It was then that he decided to devote himself entirely to creating a complete human clone. But he never imagined that science, when used for dark purposes, could destroy more than it creates. The project progressed rapidly, and gradually the scientist's mind began to open to the consortium's true interests. He noticed that his research would not be used to save lives, but rather to replace real people with obedient copies who would follow orders without question. Human cloning had been envisioned as a way to improve humanity, but now he realized he had created a tool for manipulation. Despite his ethical principles beginning to rebel against the situation, Ward was too committed to back out. Doubts consumed him, but he could no longer escape the reach of those who controlled him. As days passed, Ward began to notice that he was no longer free. His actions, routine, and research were monitored constantly. The scientist lived under growing tension, fearing something terrible might happen at any moment. The consortium seemed always one step ahead, controlling every aspect of the research and ensuring he had no way to contact the outside world. Over time, Ward began to question himself. Had he truly done anything in the name of science, or had he simply handed his skills over to an organization willing to manipulate the world for its own ends? Months of tireless work and genetic adjustments culminated in Alpha, the first fully functional human clone. After numerous tests and failures, the consortium managed to create a perfect human replica, generated from a single-cell nucleus and manipulated for accelerated growth. Alpha emerged from the incubator as an adult, with physical and biological traits indistinguishable from those of a normal person. This milestone brought both euphoria and tension to Ward, who, even as he witnessed scientific success, began to see the dangers it represented. Alpha was alive, but was not a typical human. Alpha lacked the common consciousness of a human being. There was an empty look, a strange, almost artificial presence. It was as if the human essence had been removed, leaving a compliant and soulless shell. Ward tried to interact with him, looking for signs of autonomy or personality traits, but he found only automatic responses, as if Alpha was programmed to follow commands. This creature was a reflection of the consortium's unrestrained ambition. Alpha was not a man, but a distorted reflection of what science could create. For the consortium, Alpha represented victory. With him, the possibility opened to replace anyone with a controllable copy. Alpha was a prototype of total submission, the first step toward a future in which no one could escape the consortium's influence. The excitement among the involved scientists was contagious, but Ward felt a deep unease. He knew that human cloning was a dangerous path and that total control of a human life, even an artificial one, violated the most basic ethical principles. However, the consortium cared only for power, not ethics. While Ward tried to process what he had created, Alpha was subjected to a series of physical and mental tests. They wanted to ensure the clone could act, react, and perform any function like a normal person. Each test confirmed that Alpha was perfect in the consortium's eyes. The executives viewed him as a masterpiece of biological engineering, a tool of absolute power. Ward, however, saw only a nightmare made real, something that should never have been created. And with each successful test, he felt more distant from his own humanity. The moment Ward introduced Alpha to the supervisor, Richard Sloan, was definitive. Sloan, an authoritarian and cold figure, showed little interest in scientific complexity. He wanted to know just one thing: can he be completely controlled? Ward replied that he could, but in that moment, he was overtaken by a feeling of helplessness. He realized the consortium had not created Alpha for any noble purpose, but for a game of absolute manipulation. Sloan wanted guarantees that Alpha would obey blindly, and it was then that Ward realized he had lost control over what he had created. The success of Alpha was celebrated by the consortium as a triumph, but to Ward, it was a death sentence for human free will. He began to understand that the consortium wanted more than just clones. They wished to dominate the world through them. The idea that Alpha could replace someone real and take the place of a genuine person was an unbearable thought. For Dr. Ward, what was once a scientific breakthrough was now becoming a sinister threat. He knew that from that moment, there was no turning back. He was caught up in a conspiracy from which he might never escape. The secret installation where Ward was taken was located on Alexander Island, one of the most inhospitable in Antarctica. Isolated from any trace of civilization, the island was surrounded by mountains of ice and constant mist. Access to the location was nearly impossible, and Ward was taken there on a military aircraft, without being allowed to know its exact location. The lab was located beneath the ice, protected from any satellite or espionage attempt. There, between frozen walls and underground tunnels, the consortium had its experimental field out of reach of any regulation. Inside the base, Ward saw a world apart, a facility with technology so advanced it seemed to come from a science fiction movie. Machines monitored every move the scientists made, and cameras recorded everything, from each test to the smallest interactions. There were no windows, only artificial light that maintained a cold and controlled atmosphere. The rooms were cold and sterile, with nothing to remind one of the outside world. Ward began to feel that this place was less a laboratory and more a technological prison, a place he might never leave. The consortium had equipped the base with state-of-the-art artificial incubators, capable of generating clones at an alarming speed. Each incubator was a transparent capsule where clones developed as artificial fetuses, under constant monitoring. The scientists controlled each stage of development, manipulating even the smallest details of the clone's DNA. The technology was fascinating, but there was something profoundly disturbing about the process. The idea of creating human beings without natural birth and without any emotional connection to the world left him uneasy. Ward began to notice that the other scientists there did not share his ethical concerns. To them, the goal was simple: complete the project without questioning, following orders, and ensuring the expected results for the consortium. Everyone seemed to accept the idea of being in an isolated place, far from any law or morality. The scientists continued to work with an almost robotic efficiency, as if they too were part of the experiment. Ward began to feel isolated, realizing he was the only one questioning what was really happening there. However, the inhospitable environment of the base and the constant pressure to produce results began to affect Ward's mind. He felt increasingly trapped, with no prospect of escape or contact with the outside world. The few times he questioned his superiors about the true purposes of the project, he was met with cold looks and evasive answers. In no time, he understood that his role there was strictly scientific, and he would never have access to control or high-level decisions. This disheartened him profoundly. The scientist began living in a constant state of fear and distrust. Every time he saw a security guard or supervisor approaching, he felt a chill down his spine. He began to realize that every step he took was being monitored, that he did not even have the freedom to walk around the facility. The laboratory's cold and silent corridors became a labyrinth for him, where claustrophobia and paranoia reigned. Dr. Ward now understood that he was trapped in a web far larger than he could imagine, and with each passing day, the feeling of regret grew within him. The laboratory where Ward worked was a well of technologies that surpassed everything he had known up to then. The most impressive innovation was the artificial incubators, which allowed the gestation of clones without the need for a human womb. These were transparent capsules, beds of pulsing lights, where the environment was meticulously controlled, replicating ideal conditions of temperature and nutrition. Ward found himself both fascinated and horrified. He had helped create a technology that made birth a purely scientific process, devoid of any emotional or human connection. Each incubator was equipped with sensors that monitored the clone's development, regulating even cell division and vital activities, something he had only read about in theories. Here, the cloning process could be adjusted to speed up or slow down as needed. This meant that, in weeks, a clone could be grown to adulthood. To the consortium, this represented an unprecedented advance, a way to have ready human replacements in record time. To Ward, it was science being used for purposes he had never imagined. The speed of the clone's development process required constant adjustments. The scientists in the laboratory frequently recalibrated the incubators to prevent problems like premature aging or cellular degeneration that occurred in clones. This extreme manipulation brought almost total control over the body, but it left the clones mentally susceptible. The absence of a childhood, of experiences, and of true memories made them completely docile. To the consortium, this was perfect. To Ward, it was a threat to human free will. The idea that it was possible to manufacture humans on a large scale began to provoke deep unease in Ward. He observed the clones in the incubators and felt they were mere shadows of humanity, forms without essence, an empty reflection of real people. He tried to ignore the feelings of repulsion he felt when watching the clones develop, but the idea that they would soon be ready to replace a real person terrified him. With each clone that appeared, he felt the weight of what he had done become unbearable. Ward began to feel responsible for each clone that left the incubator. He knew they were beings who would never have a life of their own, existing only to obey and follow orders. They were soulless bodies, molded and controlled by those who held the power over the technology. He began to question the role of science and the way knowledge was being distorted. However, each time he expressed his concerns, he received cold looks and evasive responses, as if he were a foolish idealist, unable to see the project's true potential. Although he was aware that the consortium was turning human beings into puppets, Ward continued working. He no longer knew if he was there of his own free will, or if he simply could not escape. Each day was a painful reminder that he had become an accomplice in an operation with the objective of absolute control over humanity. The incubators, once a symbol of his scientific ambition, had turned into biological prisons. It was difficult to bear his own reflection in the capsules. He knew those human forms were the result of his own creation, and that the evil that came from them was also his responsibility. The consortium demanded perfection, and for this, Dr. Ward and his team used cutting-edge genetic manipulation techniques. To avoid issues with aging cells and epigenetic damage, Ward applied CRISPR to each clone, a method that allowed him to correct DNA before the embryo began to develop. It was a meticulous process where each gene was inspected and, if necessary, adjusted to ensure the clone's ideal appearance and health. For Ward, however, this perfection was not natural. It was a mask, a manipulation that turned clones into control tools. Each DNA adjustment was like programming, creating a person who would never have the chance to be who they really were. The clones did not inherit genetic flaws, traits, or natural characteristics. They were custom-made, according to the consortium's interests. CRISPR allowed them to eliminate even minor defects that might make the clones less attractive or productive. At the same time, Ward knew they were creating people to obey, not to live. It was a perfection that cost the human essence itself. With each manipulation, he felt more trapped by his own technology. To solve the issue of accelerated aging, Ward also introduced epigenetic factors that reprogrammed the clone's cells, erasing any trace of wear and tear. This prevented the cells from carrying age marks or signs of deterioration. The consortium demanded flawless bodies, capable of a long, robust life, identical in appearance to the person they would replace. Ward knew that by removing these marks of time, he was stripping the clones of any trace of history or experience. They were eternally young and without identity. However, this extreme manipulation created an emptiness in the clones' cells. Even though they were biologically perfect, they seemed like hollow bodies, without expression, without a soul of their own. Ward realized that erasing age and life marks made the clones biological machines, devoid of any real connection to the world. This tormented him more and more. CRISPR and epigenetic control allowed him to shape human biology in an extraordinary way, but at the expense of any humanity the clones might have had. The consortium saw these advances as scientific achievements. To them, the clones were an ideal solution: perfect bodies, youthful appearance, total obedience. Ward, on the other hand, began to question whether the clones could even be considered human. They had the form, appearance, and vital functions of a human being, but were merely distorted reflections, programmed to serve without question. What he saw as a corruption of science, the consortium saw as an opportunity. They believed they were creating a new humanity, submissive and malleable. With each new clone emerging from the incubators, Ward felt something essential was being lost. Genetic manipulations, while ensuring perfection and obedience, also erased the uniqueness and essence that make each person unique. He knew that by removing natural traits and imperfections, they were erasing any possibility of autonomy or individuality. It was as if the clones were facade beings, instruments created to obey. The consortium had its perfect tool, but Ward felt himself sinking further into the horror of his own creation. In the first cloning experiments, Ward and his team faced severe failures that almost led to the project's collapse. The clones, subjected to an accelerated development process, exhibited severe physical deformities. They were trying to make a human body grow in weeks, when naturally it would take years. At first, the clones could not sustain life, as their organs developed in a disordered way. Each failure was a brutal reminder of science's limitations and the complexity of the human body, something Ward felt increasingly weighed down by. The failures occurred because, in trying to force growth, the scientists were not respecting the natural rhythm of human cells. The consortium, however, pressed for quick results, impatient with the problems and ethical limitations. To them, any failure was merely a temporary obstacle. Each clone that failed was discarded and replaced by the next. For Ward, this was unbearable, as he saw his research turning into a cold and ruthless production line, where human bodies were treated as disposable objects of a never-ending experiment. The failed clones remained etched in Ward's memory, their disfigured forms as haunting reminders of the consortium's unbridled ambition. He remembered how he looked at those incubators, with the chambers being disconnected when a clone could not survive. The laboratory became more and more like a cemetery of failed experiments, a constant reminder of what science without ethics could cause. With each clone that succumbed, Ward felt his responsibility grow heavier, as if each failure was a punishment for his own greed. Determined to overcome the limitations, the consortium's scientists began experimenting with even deeper manipulations of the clone's genetic code. Rather than slowing down the process, they chose to adjust the genetics to ensure the clones could withstand rapid growth. They manipulated the genes as if they were program codes, trying to create a human body that would obey the imposed pace. Ward, despite his reservations, found himself compelled to collaborate, feeling more and more like part of a system he could no longer control. He knew this could not end well. As the adjustments progressed, the clones began to survive the process. They emerged from the incubators with strong, stable bodies, but mentally something was still wrong. The accelerated growth created a kind of emptiness, as if the clones were incapable of developing their own thoughts. The consortium, however, did not see this as a problem. To them, the absence of questioning was an advantage. Ward, on the other hand, saw this stability as a failure in something much deeper: the absence of a true identity, a consciousness. These initial failures were a breaking point for Ward. He began to question whether he should have accepted the project, whether he should have pursued scientific advancements at any cost. He felt trapped in a cycle of manipulation and control that deviated from science's original purpose. The clones had no soul, no human essence. They were mere reflections of what the consortium wanted them to be. The science he once saw as a path to salvation had now become an instrument of destruction, and Ward began to realize he was merely a cog in a machine far larger and darker than he had imagined. With the initial success of human cloning, the consortium finally revealed its true intent to Ward: to replace figures of power with controllable clones. For Ward, who believed he was creating life to cure diseases and extend human existence, this revelation was a blow. He realized that his research had been instrumentalized to create a system of domination, where human beings were mere manipulable pieces. The consortium did not merely want to improve humanity. They wanted to turn it into an extension of their interests. Instead of saving lives, he had helped build an invisible prison. The consortium showed Ward that they planned to replace political leaders, business people, celebrities, and anyone who could influence the masses. Each clone would have a neurological programming that prevented it from questioning orders, making it a puppet under the control of those with the power. These clones were not meant to live. They were designed to obey and execute commands without hesitation. For Ward, it became clear that there was no intention of using cloning for good. They were creating a new humanity, a population of beings without autonomy, allowing the consortium to maintain control over global destiny. Ward's horror grew as he understood the extent of this plan. He began to realize the consortium saw no limit to their experiments. Any influential person could be replaced if they did not follow the established agenda. There was no room for resistance or dissent. It was a plan for global domination, where free will and individuality were considered obstacles. Ward found himself in a dilemma. He had helped open the door to a future of absolute control, but was powerless to prevent his own knowledge from being used so perversely. Each day, the consortium became more ambitious. Ward watched in horror as the scientists around him worked with an almost robotic dedication, developing new techniques to perfect clone control. His superiors encouraged him to continue contributing, saying he was an important piece in a revolutionary project. However, what they called a revolution was, for Ward, a destruction of the human essence. He began to distance himself emotionally from the work, trying, at least mentally, to detach from what he was helping to build. Ward tried to oppose the project, but whenever he suggested a pause or ethical review, his comments were immediately dismissed. The consortium treated him as a tool, a means to achieve their ends, without any consideration for his principles. Gradually, Ward realized he was isolated, with no one sharing his concerns. He had nowhere to run, and he knew that if he tried to leave the project, his life would be at risk. The consortium would not allow him to leave without paying the price for his knowledge. Over time, Ward accepted that he was trapped in a no-win situation. The weight of what he had helped build consumed him daily, but he no longer had the strength to fight. He knew that by staying, he was complicit with the consortium, but fleeing was nearly impossible. The isolated laboratory in Antarctica was both his prison and his punishment. Each new clone created was a silent reminder of his powerlessness, and the thought that these clones would replace real people became a constant nightmare, a torment he could no longer ignore. To ensure that the clones performed their functions without question, the consortium implemented advanced mind control techniques. They developed brain stimulation methods that eliminated any trace of independent thought. By subjecting the clones to targeted neurological impulses, they managed to control every action, every word, and even the emotions of the clones. These techniques made the clones perfect puppets, a feat the consortium celebrated as the pinnacle of science. To Ward, however, it was the apex of humanity's degradation. The first time Ward witnessed the application of these techniques on a clone, he felt a chill. The clone, who had previously appeared minimally aware of his surroundings, was suddenly transformed into an empty shell. His eyes, once reactive, became dull, devoid of any sign of life. Ward tried to talk to the clone but received only automated, emotionless responses. He felt he was facing something inhuman, a creation that, although physically perfect, was mentally shattered. This was not science, it was brutal manipulation. The scientists responsible for the clone's mind control seemed delighted with the results. They spoke of the possibility of eliminating any trace of rebellion or questioning, creating absolute obedience. Each clone was programmed to respond to specific commands, without hesitation. For the consortium, this was a guarantee that their interests would never be challenged. For Ward, it was a terrible reminder of how science could be distorted. He felt it violated the most basic human quality, the capacity for choice, for resistance, for individuality. These mind control techniques evolved to a frightening level. Not only were the clones' actions manipulated, but even their thoughts could be artificially induced. The neurological programming made them believe they were acting of their own volition, when in reality, they were mere puppets of a control system. Ward began to realize that the consortium wanted more than just clones. They wanted to create an army of people who would never rebel, who would never question orders from above. The idea that these clones could be placed in positions of power was something Ward could not accept. He knew that if they continued developing these techniques, they could soon replace the leaders of any country, artists, influencers, and anyone they wished to control. It was an apocalyptic scenario where free will would be eradicated. Each day, he felt the consortium was closer to achieving its goal, a world where every important decision was made by clones under absolute control. Despite his fear, Ward found himself unable to stop what he had started. He was surrounded by scientists who saw neurological manipulation as a scientific wonder, an opportunity to create the perfect society. The consortium offered everyone a vision of a future where chaos and disorder would be eliminated, but Ward knew this meant eliminating humanity itself. Deep down, he understood that his involvement was not just scientific, but a sentence that bound him to unbearable guilt. He knew that any attempt to leave the project now would inevitably lead to his own destruction. The consortium's operation advanced to an even more sinister phase, replacing influential figures in society with perfectly controlled clones. For Ward, this revelation felt like a punch in the gut. People who had gained power and respect were being replaced by artificial versions, devoid of their own will. Politicians, artists, and business people were the first targets, as they had the power to shape public opinion and global policies. The consortium didn't just want to observe them, it wanted to manipulate them as puppets. Ward was informed about the first replacements, a list that included the names of presidents, entertainment stars, and financial magnates. He felt his heart tighten as he heard the names. Many of them were figures he admired, people who had positively influenced the world at some point. Knowing these people were no longer human, but obedient clones made him question everything. He wondered how many of the decisions shaping the planet were not made by flesh and blood beings, but by empty copies controlled by the consortium. The consortium chose replacements with precision, always considering the impact that person had on the public. Any public figure who resisted the consortium's interests became a target. Thus, they could maintain the original public image while manipulating their actions and decisions. It was a carefully orchestrated farce, where each clone became an actor on a global stage, playing roles written by those in power. Ward understood this was a perfect control strategy, but he also knew it was something monstrous. The clones were programmed to be perfect imitations. The consortium implanted false memories, recreated habits, quirks, and even personality traits. The clone of a political leader, for example, would remember events they had never lived through, would believe in ideals that in reality did not exist. It was a complex psychological operation, where the clone not only appeared to be the person replaced, but also believed it. In the public's eyes, the clone was the person. In Ward's eyes, it was a terrible lie, a manipulation of human essence itself. Over time, the consortium began to intensify the replacements. Figures from the entertainment, technology, and sports worlds began to be cloned. Ward remembered the first celebrities replaced. He knew these people impacted millions of lives, shaped behaviors, and influenced ideals. To the consortium, they were powerful tools, figures who could be manipulated to create trends to guide public thinking. Knowing this, Ward began to fear the reach of his own research, which now affected not only politics but also culture and the collective mind. With each new replacement, Ward felt increasingly tormented. He had helped create a system where truth no longer existed. People trusted blindly in public figures they admired, unaware that these people were no longer the same. Each time he saw a new clone sent into the world, he felt he had contributed to destroying humanity from the inside out. The science he once believed was the key to a better future had now become the instrument of a cruel farce, where nothing was real and where no one was safe anymore. The case of Steve Jobs was one of the consortium's first public failures and had a profound impact on Ward. Jobs was one of the world's greatest innovators, with a vision that redefined technology and inspired millions of people. But the consortium saw more than a visionary in him. They saw an opportunity to directly control global technological development. When they decided to replace Jobs with a clone, Ward was one of the few scientists informed of the procedure. Despite knowing the risk, he was unable to prevent the consortium from carrying out the plan. Jobs' clone was created using the best genetic manipulation and neurological control techniques available. The appearance was identical to the original, and personality and memory were replicated with impressive detail. The clone took the stage at an important Apple presentation, broadcast live to millions of viewers. However, right from the start, something began to go wrong. For Ward, it was like watching an impending tragedy. He knew the pressure placed on the clone could lead to a collapse. The technology enabling his control was far from infallible. During the presentation, the clone began to show signs of disorientation. Words were misplaced, sentences interrupted, until he finally collapsed before the audience like a machine shutting down. Ward watched the broadcast in horror. He knew the public would see it as a physical breakdown, but he knew the truth. The neurological control system had failed, and the clone succumbed to the overload. It was a bitter reminder that genetic and mental manipulation was a double-edged sword, capable of destroying as much as it could control. The consortium quickly covered up the incident, claiming that Jobs had suffered a health crisis, but Ward knew that was not the truth. The consortium's executives downplayed the failure and treated the case as an isolated issue, of no significance to the larger project. For Ward, however, it was a wake-up call. If a clone of such an influential public figure as Jobs could fail, any clone was subject to the same fate. He feared that the next replacements, destined for even more sensitive positions, would end up exposing the project irreparably. The public death of Jobs' clone marked a turning point for Ward. He began to realize that control science was not as absolute as the consortium believed. In the consortium's mind, technical perfection was achievable and irrefutable, but to Ward, each clone was a ticking time bomb, a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. He began questioning the limits of human manipulation. To what extent could a human being be replaced by a perfect copy? This experience reinforced his fear that the consortium was meddling with forces they could not control. After the incident, Ward attempted to warn his superiors about the risks of continuing the cloning project. He pointed out the issues with neurological stability, but his appeals were ignored. The consortium did not care about the risks. For them, the number of clones was what mattered, not their longevity. Ward understood that to the consortium, each clone was disposable, just a piece in a chain of replacements that they could expand indefinitely. This cruel indifference made him realize that, ultimately, he was surrounded by people who would never hesitate to destroy lives to maintain control. After the incident with Jobs' clone, Ward began to feel he himself was in danger. The paranoia grew with each passing day, and he could no longer trust anyone. He knew the consortium was monitoring his every step, and that any attempt to question the project could put him on the replacement list. Ward wondered if his own life was safe. He feared that at any moment, he himself could be replaced by a clone that would obey the consortium's orders without question, erasing any trace of his true existence. Ward began to study in detail the routines of the scientists and agents around him. He realized he was not the only one under constant surveillance, but this only heightened his sense of vulnerability. He watched his colleagues with suspicion, wondering if any of them had already been replaced. With each new face, he questioned whether he was still looking at a human or a clone. This constant tension began to erode his psyche, and he began living in a permanent state of alert, as if any misstep could be his last. After months of living in this cycle of paranoia, Ward finally decided to escape. He knew the base in Antarctica was impenetrable, but he saw no other option. He began planning, studying each access route, the security routines, and even the blind spots of the cameras. It was a risky plan, and he knew he had only one chance. He knew that if he were caught, he would never have the opportunity to escape again. But the idea of continuing to live under the consortium's control was unbearable, and Ward mentally prepared himself for an almost suicidal escape. On the night of his escape, Ward used a planned distraction to evade the guards. He knew he would not have much time and would be tracked as soon as his absence was noticed. In a frenetic sequence, he managed to get out of the base and reach one of the transport routes used only for emergencies. In the dark Antarctic night, Ward felt small and fragile, but for the first time, he felt he had control over his own life. There were no guarantees he would survive in such a harsh environment, but to him, it was better than remaining imprisoned. After days on the run, Ward finally reached an abandoned research station, where he found communication equipment and used it to call for help. When he finally reached the mainland, he hid in distant cities, changing his identity and avoiding any technology that could expose him. Every face in the crowd was a threat, every new place a risk. He lived in a constant state of vigilance, knowing that the consortium was looking for him and would go to great lengths to eliminate him. Ward's paranoia intensified. He began to doubt even his own sanity, questioning whether he had really escaped or if it was all part of a larger plan. He knew he could be replaced at any moment, and that his escape might be only a postponement of the inevitable. He no longer knew whom to trust and began living like a shadow, a man who, for all practical purposes, had disappeared. His life had become a constant game of hide and seek, where the consortium was an invisible, ever-present enemy. With Ward missing, the consortium began expanding its cloning and control plans. Knowing that cloning technology was increasingly perfected, the consortium's leaders decided to invest in even more strategic targets. For them, controlling politicians and celebrities was not enough. The next step was to control military and intelligence figures, securing an influence network that extended beyond politics and culture. They wanted absolute control over global security and over forces that might oppose them. The consortium's plans included replacing high-ranking generals and commanders, especially those with access to nuclear weapons and defense strategies. The idea of controlling the armed forces of global powers was the ultimate goal of their domination strategy. The consortium's leaders knew that replacing these targets would not be easy and would require even more stable and reliable clones. To Ward, who watched everything unfold from afar, it was a nightmare on the verge of becoming reality. He knew that if they continued, the entire world would be under control. Besides military leaders, the consortium planned to replace intelligence agents and members of organizations like Interpol and the UN. The idea was to infiltrate their clones at all levels of power, so they could directly control sensitive and strategic information. This way, any attempt at resistance or investigation into their activities could be easily suppressed. For them, each clone was a tool for manipulation and control, and the consortium saw in this expansion the perfect future, a world where everyone would obey without question. The consortium's expansion was accompanied by an improvement in cloning and neurological control techniques. They sought to increase the clone's durability and reduce the risk of failures like the one that occurred with Jobs' clone. At the same time, they began exploring new control methods, including ways to monitor the clones remotely. These advances allowed clones to be controlled more efficiently, eliminating failures and ensuring absolute obedience, regardless of distance or context. Each new scientific advance was an additional tool for the consortium, and Ward knew they would not stop until they had replaced all important targets. He saw the expansion as a monster growing in the shadows, fueled by technology and the unlimited power the consortium possessed. The public figures who were still human were constantly under surveillance, and Ward knew that at any moment they could be replaced. There was no longer a limit to the consortium's ambition, and the future seemed to be dominated by a regime where power was in the hands of programmed clones. To Ward, the consortium's expansion was a reflection of the destruction of what it meant to be human. With each new clone replacing a real person, he felt that freedom was disappearing. Cloning, which he had once dreamed would bring healing and hope, had become an endless nightmare, a tool of global domination. The consortium, increasingly powerful, was becoming an invisible threat, present in every decision, every policy, and every public figure. Ward knew his escape was only temporary, but he also knew his struggle was a desperate attempt to save the last vestige of humanity that still remained. In 2004, as a fugitive, Ward learned from anonymous sources that the consortium was convening an emergency meeting in New York. It was an unusual move, and he knew that an assembly of this magnitude signaled a new phase in the operation. His contacts said that all the scientists and project leaders would be called, along with the key executives responsible for financing it. Ward realized this meeting would define the direction of the consortium's expansion. As dangerous as it was, he felt he had to be there, not only to learn about the plans, but to understand how much of his life was still at risk. Ward managed to disguise himself and infiltrate the luxurious hotel where the meeting was to be held, even though his safety was at stake. There, he observed the intense movement of executives, scientists, and security personnel moving through the building in a strict and controlled choreography. He knew that each face there had a specific function, and that everyone was prepared to eliminate any threat to the project. With cautious steps, Ward found a spot where he could listen to parts of the discussions without being seen, and soon his suspicions were confirmed. The consortium was in a phase of aggressive expansion. During the meeting, Richard Sloan, the ruthless project leader, presented the new goals. He detailed the advances made in mind control technology, revealing plans to expand the replacement of public figures on a global scale. Ward listened with growing horror. Sloan made it clear that there were no longer any ethical or security limits. Clones would now replace high-ranking political figures in multiple nations, even heads of state. They were already close to controlling institutions like the UN and the IMF, and the next step was to influence the military forces and intelligence systems. When Sloan began discussing the need to restructure the team, Ward understood that it was only a matter of time before the consortium began eliminating scientists who knew too much. He had no illusions. Restructuring meant getting rid of those who could become risks, including himself. He was no longer as useful as before. Now, he was a threat who knew every detail of the project. The escape he had managed so far was a temporary truce, but soon he knew the consortium would start a definitive hunt to eliminate him. During a break in the meeting, Ward slipped into the hotel corridors, trying to process what he had just heard. He knew that if he stayed in New York, it would only be a matter of time before the consortium's agents found and eliminated him. He needed to disappear completely, to vanish in a way the consortium could not trace. He began making desperate plans, considering the possibility of abandoning his identity, his contacts, and disappearing into anonymity, leaving no trace of his existence. Without a second thought, Ward escaped through the hotel's emergency exits and vanished into the New York night. He knew he could never return to the life he knew, and that his life from then on would be a struggle to remain hidden. His decision to disappear completely meant giving up any connection that might lead him back to his former life. He knew he would be hunted relentlessly, but he also knew this was his last chance. Disappearing was both an escape and a sentence to live without roots, without identity, but it was the only way to survive. Now, living in the shadows, Ward took refuge in small towns, constantly changing identity and location. He was always on the move, knowing the consortium would stop at nothing to track him down. He felt like a shadow, a man without a past or future, surviving with the bare minimum, always alert to signs of danger. Each new place was only a temporary refuge, for he knew the consortium could find him at any moment. Paranoia had become his only companion, a constant tension he could no longer shake. Ward lived like a ghost, moving from town to town, always suspicious of those who crossed his path. He spent nights in cheap motels, frequently changing phones and documents. He avoided any technology that might reveal his location, but he felt the consortium's grip tightening with each new escape. He realized that each day, finding a safe place became more difficult. The consortium's agents were tireless, and he knew he couldn't relax for even a second. Despite his exhaustion, Ward made an effort to document all the information he had about the consortium. He created a secret journal where he detailed each phase of the project, each advance in cloning, and each name he knew to be involved. His goal was to leave a record that could one day be found by someone who understood the gravity of what he had discovered. He knew his end was inevitable, but he didn't want the consortium to get away unscathed. He tried to gather evidence, hoping that one day, the truth might be revealed to the world. His fight against the consortium had become a solitary, silent mission. With no one to trust, Ward tried to stay alive and alert, while recording his knowledge in codes and encrypted messages. He knew that if he were captured, everything would be lost, but he continued to resist. His life was fragmented into pieces of a puzzle, and he made sure to leave clues, fragments of information that might one day reveal the project's horror to the public. It was a small hope, but it was the only thing keeping him going. Over time, Ward began to see signs that the consortium was everywhere. Politicians with strange behaviors, celebrities acting robotically, global leaders promoting identical, aligned policies. He knew many of these familiar faces no longer belonged to human beings, but to clones, obeying a global domination agenda. On every television screen, he saw the effects of his work, the same clones he had helped create now infiltrating daily life, shaping society according to the consortium's will. Now, Ward knows that his escape will not save him forever. He lives with the weight of guilt, aware that he helped create a tool for mass manipulation. However, his determination to expose the consortium remains alive. He fights against exhaustion and persecution, determined to preserve the truth in fragments that might survive. Ward still hopes that, even while living like a shadow, his story and revelations may one day be found, so that the world understands the horror hidden beneath the ice, and perhaps resists before it's too late.